Hello, my name is Igors Rautmanis. I'm based in Latvia and Riga. My name is Russian, but by nationality, I'm a Latvian, raised by Latvian family, but I speak Russian. I understand the cultural backgrounds of it. I'm involved in IFES International Fellowship and Evangelical Students, training the leaders across the Europe. And my primary focus to release the potential in leaders that they could contribute with their gifts and abilities to the kingdom.
And I'm Amanda Jackson, and we're going to do this seminar together on leadership journey. I work with, or I lead the Women's Commission of the World Evangelical Alliance. I'm Australian and British, both. And I live in London, and yeah, we're going to have a conversation around what leadership can look like. We thought we'd have a conversation rather than doing a more formal presentation, because we're talking about leadership being a journey, being a conversation, being something you grow into rather than something you just have formed perfectly from the start. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Igor some questions because he's got so much experience around mentoring, and then he's going to ask me some questions as well. And we hope that they are informative, and at the end of the recording, in the actual seminar, you'll be able to ask questions, make comments, and yeah, hopefully have a really great discussion. Igors, I know from our conversations together that you've got lots of experience in many nations of Europe, and you've just mentioned that you've got a sort of a double national heritage and cultural heritage, and you've invested in many young leaders, many students. So you mentor, and what do you actually mean by mentoring, and why should we get involved?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm coming from Eastern Europe context, and especially in our context, the mentoring was quite new concept, and even introducing to be accountable to somebody. It sometimes feel often policing somebody. There's a trust issue. But many years ago, I went to studies to the States, to the Fuller Seminary, and I came across the man, Bobby Clinton, who introduced the mentoring for me. And that was really refreshing perspective on relationships. Because in the New Testament, at least more than 80 times, there's an emphasis, one another. Mm-hmm. And the mentoring somehow summarized that concept, and it's basically meant to help. It's the simplest definition of mentoring in my perspective. It's to help, to come alongside. Mm-hmm. Because I realized, even looking in the scripture, God never intended us succeed on our own. We actually really naturally see that in any other areas of life, like athletes. I don't know any athlete who become a champion or world champion on his own. There's always coach. Any musician, artist, there's always the story behind it. There's somebody inspired, somebody came alongside. And I looked in the scripture and I realized that's actually true. It's God never intended us to do things alone. Even Jesus never did things alone. And the mentoring fundamental, simple definition is somebody coming alongside to help.
That's a great definition. And it also means that help gets a really personal, strong sense of meaning, doesn't it? You mentioned to me that you really like the story in the Bible of Jethro and Moses' relationship in Exodus. Because Jethro was a great mentor to his son-in-law. Can you take us through what you mean by that and how that relationship shows mentoring at its best?
Yes, it's often that's what I came across with the different leaders in also church context. They said, okay, mentoring is not mentioned in the Bible. There is mentioned discipleship. We all do the discipleship, but I said, yes, they both of them relational processes, but they don't contradict, but actually mentoring expands the aspect of help. There's a different ways we could provide a help. And we cannot put under discipleship all the relationships which we read in the scripture. And one of them is a relationship between Jethro, father-in-law, and Moses. But there was crucial help father-in-law provided for Moses, and with really important task, responsibility. And it was healthy relationship where Moses was willing to receive that help, rather just, saying, you just got converted, you just find out how great this God is, who you are, why you have a right to actually challenge me. Because father-in-law observed what Moses did. He saw the long line of people waiting to have a, audience to the Moses, that Moses have that wisdom and enables, to share and help people make a decision. But nobody challenged that approach. He had tribe leaders there. There are other kind of leaders, elders, but they never dared to challenge that. But father-in-law, with not kind of hidden agenda, he didn't have any hidden agenda. He just thought, what are you doing is not sustainable. That's the only thing. He was concerned for well-being of Moses as a leader and well-being of those people. That's his only agenda. And he was not limited by the titles, not by experiences. He said, let's listen. I will come with suggestion. There's a different ways to do it. And you're free to bring that before God. And you're free to kind of consult with God and see if this is the right way to do it. But I would suggest delegate, train people, do it differently. And I think this is one of the ways you would see that was kind of healthy mentoring relationship, where somebody come with experience and expertise in completely different area.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. You went through quite a few different points there in what made Jethro a good mentor. I'm just wondering whether you could maybe expand on some of those principles for, us today, for pastors, for other people in Christian leadership. What would it mean to find a Jethro? Because Jethro, as you said, wasn't a great man of faith. He was just a wise person, an experienced person. And as you said also, he had no hidden agenda, which I think is really important. So, can you take us through some of those principles when you mentor now?
Yes, when we come back to the fundamental aspect of definition of what is a mentoring, mentoring is help. And it's really crucial that help is not defined by you, but by person whom you're helping. That's one thing. It's just when I talk about not hidden agenda. Maybe sometimes person himself don't realize, Moses didn't realize at that point that is help. But when the Jethro's point to the problem, then Moses recognized there is a problem. Then only then he was willing to listen to the advice. But I think it's really important if we come alongside somebody and we want to help, the help should be defined or acknowledged by the person whom we're helping, rather just I coming with my hidden agenda. We only could help to those who are willing to help. That's the one thing. Second principle I think is important. We see, if I can look in this particular example, it's a first observe what person does and just ask a question. This is exactly what Jethro did. He asked the question, tell me what you do, why you do. Instead of, what you do is wrong. You're stupid. But it's rather kind of said, what are you doing? And Moses were explaining what he is doing. And then he kind of share what he observed, what he noticed. And he was not thinking, how he will react, what he will think. He basically said, look, I think there is the dangers of the way you do it because it's not sustainable. And he came with a proposal, but not kind of say demanding you do it. We said, bring before God, pray about it, and see if this is the way you want to kind of perceive the leadership this way.
It's interesting because Moses was an established leader by that stage. And we often think about mentoring as being for young people, don't we? We mentor students or younger people, who are coming up to leadership. But you're really saying we need it at every stage of our lives. So what are some practical advice steps that you can give us that if we are a bit older and experienced, how can we still go about getting some benefit, and who do we go to and how do we get it?
I think it's, again, going back to this fundamental question of the need, where you see the need in what area of life. And there could be a number of different people who come alongside, rather not one person. Often people feel, I need a Superman, who the holy of holy, who can mentor me. I think there's a dangerous in that approach. We have one Superman, is Jesus. It's enough. With him, he come alongside and help us. But there's a different people who could help us in different areas of life. It depends what is your need. Maybe, the older generation people, especially experienced during the COVID time, I need help with the, online platforms. How do I use the Zoom? How do I use, Microsoft Teams? How do I use the Skype? How do I use the Instagram? The younger generation, they maybe don't have that experience in a spiritual life experience, but they could come and help you, which actually better use it, some of those tools, and then actually empower you to be more effective. It's like, the Jethro's empowered Moses to be better in delegation and empowering other people. That would be one approach. But another thing, what it's really important to have the people around us, and I see mentors. It's a person like a mirror. Another metaphor I would use for mentoring process, to have somebody who holds the mirror in front of me. Every day, all of us check our appearance in the mirror. Why? Where is your faith? Trust that you look great. But we know I cannot simply trust how I feel about it. I need to check my appearance, because that has some contributions, hinders or helps my engagement with other people. Cars has a mirrors. Why? Because we have a blind spots. We see what we see and we don't see what we don't see. And just a conversation, regular conversation with somebody, it creates a reflection and helps us to see maybe what we don't notice. And that is really helpful way for us to continue to this journey, making less crashes or damages in a life. And that's one thing. It's another person, conversation with another person, it creates a mirror, how these things looks like. Second thing, why I see the value of the mentoring relationships, it's about the perspective. We cannot change circumstances, but what we can change, how we view things. How we view things will define how we respond, and how we will respond will define what impact we make. And again, often, what I see, what it helped me to change my perspective, it's conversation with somebody who is really good listener and who asks me questions and affirms or challenge me. Or biographies. It's like, having conversation with that person. Or Bible, it is also conversation with God. It changed my perspective. And that's another way I see the value of mentoring, and it's healthy in a regular basis. Check yourself in front of the mirror.
I love that analogy, the mirror, and then having a different perspective. Thanks, Igors. we're going to have a little pause here, but remember that if you have comments or questions about anything that Igors has said or raised, you can put them in the chat on Zoom, and we'll have time in the second part of the seminar to explore those things further. Thanks, Igors.
Thank you for your questions. Amanda, I've been sharing about the mentoring, but one of the aspects I hadn't touched is the mentoring between different genders. Can you help us to look in this mentoring relationship, how that plays between the genders?
I think it can be a key when people talk about women and men. We know that they're created equal and that we want women to flourish and men to flourish, but somehow, sometimes the gender issue gets in the way. And so women end up missing out, I think, because they've got fewer role models, they've got fewer opportunities, whereas young men and men have a sort of a natural bonding with other older leaders. So I think it is harder in many church settings, Christian organizations as well, for women to use their gifting, their training, their talent. And it's not necessarily something that has been decided in law, but it's just something that's happened. And sometimes it's, a few key passages in the Bible are quoted. And yet when you look at other passages in the Bible, it's pretty clear that there were women who were teaching, who were prophesying, leading house churches. And I love the idea of looking at how men and women can work more closely together, because it will encourage women, it will encourage more collaboration, and it will be a real witness to our societies, which are really torn apart by the whole issue of women and men. And I think too, the journey for women can be different because of family. Women are the ones who have children. They're generally the primary caregivers. They tend to be the ones who also look after, parents and parents-in-law. And they do most of the tasks associated with running the home. And so those things maybe pull you back from, outside the home opportunities. And they're wonderful roles to take, but they can maybe slow down a woman's journey into leadership. And some of the skills that we have as mums are not often the ones you put on a CV or on a resume. And then I think if you take a bit of time out to be a mother and a homemaker, you lose a bit of confidence, maybe in some of the other roles outside the home, and you find it harder to say yes to opportunities. So I think all those things can make it a bit more tricky for women. And I think the final one would be around mentoring, but it's sometimes harder to see other women that women can relate to, because there is a big difference between generations. Younger generation women are, they're much more confident and educated, and, they want to get out there and do things, and maybe they feel that they haven't got as many women to go to for mentoring as men do. So I think lots of those things make it a different story for women.
But when you think, do you see, or can you point to kind of examples where also cross-gender mentoring could happen? How that could kind of work out?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have men mentoring women and vice versa. It happens all the time in business and in jobs and in work. So I'm not quite sure why we get so hung up about it in Christian contexts. I think sex gets in the way a lot more than it should. And I think it's perfectly safe and amazing for men to champion women. So many women I know say that they wouldn't be in the places that they are today if their dad hadn't championed them, or their boss at work, or someone in the church, a pastor. And that can happen in lots of ways, just by encouraging them to, think about, have you applied for this? Have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about getting an extra degree? Have you had a go at? And being persistent in it. Because so many men say to me, oh, women always say no, that they don't want to do things. And I guess it is off-putting for men who are trying to do the right thing if women say no. But I guess we have to be persistent with some people who are a little bit more reluctant. And one thing that really worked, I was on the board of a charity in Australia, a big charity that looked after children. And I was the first woman on the board, and they didn't have any women in middle or senior management in the charity, even though it was a charity all about children, and 70% of the donors were women. They were making the decisions about where to give the money. And yet it was men who were running the charity. And you sort of think, well, that doesn't quite make sense in a practical way. And so I really encouraged them to find some women to mentor so that they'd be able to get into those roles. And they took a risk with a woman, a young woman, and they promoted her probably, way beyond what they, might have. And 10 years later, she has thrived under that mentoring and extra training and help that she was given. And she's now the COO of that charity. And in fact, they've appointed a woman as a CEO about 18 months ago. So I think it can work. And those men felt that they were probably taking a risk, but it was a risk worth taking. And I'm sure now they would say it was a great decision to take.
Maybe in some of other contexts, depends, church denomination, culture. Some people haven't experienced the woman in a leadership. Where you see there's the kind of positive side of it, how that plays out and how that contributes to the community, that the woman being given space to lead.
Well, I think if you look at your daughters or your sisters or your wife, you'll see that there's so much talent and gifting. And it says clearly in the Bible that God gave gifting equally to men and women. And so he must want us to use it equally. And I think it's of benefit because when we start to make decisions, I think it matters a lot if you've got women in the room. They might have a different perspective. And we need that perspective. We need men and women both making their decisions together. And I think it's toxic. We can see that in so many Christian situations, unfortunately, where men are allowed to get carried away with worldly views of leadership and celebrity. And perhaps if we had men and women sitting around the table, we might have more humble leadership. We might think more about children. We might think more about relationships with older people. We might encourage outsiders a bit more. Men are great at making transactional decisions, quick decisions based on facts. Women are much better at thinking around issues and listening and taking other things into consideration. So really, if you have both of those things together, you've got a much stronger team of co-workers. And it works, I think, in churches and also in other Christian organizations.
Yeah, it's just, for me, just thinking about my own experience listening what you're sharing, there is some difference how you behave when the woman in the room. And it's one thing, my experience working in one team with other leaders who are female, it's not what I do, but how I do. Always kind of get more on the surface, which is important, as you described. We're not only transactional decisions, we just deliver accomplish the task, but it's also important how we do it. When I talk about the mentoring, one of the biblical examples I point to Moses and Jethro's. You probably also could point out some other examples in the Bible. Any kind of examples comes in your mind when you hear I describe what is the mentoring?
Well, I love the story, the book of Ruth, because I think you do see mentoring there between Naomi and Ruth, but also involving Boaz. I think Naomi was actually a little secret mentor to Boaz as well. Let me explain. So Naomi appears to be a desperate woman, a widow, poor, no sons to look after her. And she calls herself Mara, doesn't she? She says, my life is bitter. But somehow her faith is still there. And even though she seemingly doesn't have much to offer, Ruth detects her faith in God and wants to follow her. And that's an amazing thing. And they become a team. They become this wonderful team of helpers. They help each other. I loved your definition of mentoring, is simply to come alongside and help. So Naomi was able to give Ruth advice about customs back in Israel. She warned her what to do and what not to do. She told her about the law and what her rights were. And Ruth is able to work really hard. She is a good woman. She's a servant-hearted woman, and she's also a bold woman. And Naomi benefits from that. And I think Boaz, his relationship with Naomi is a really equal one. He's a wealthy landowner, but he treats these women with great respect, especially Ruth. He recognizes her strength and her loyalty, and I think he protects her from what he understands about society and how women can be sometimes vulnerable. And I think that's a wonderful thing that Christian men can do for women in our society, is to be protectors, to be champions, to be advisors, to come alongside. But I think Naomi has to push Boaz to realize that there's even more to his relationship with these women. He's a good man. He's a wonderful man, kind, and obviously a good boss. But it's Naomi who says to Ruth, well, you've got to go and suggest to him that you could be his wife.
Yes.
And so it takes Naomi to do that. Boaz knows how to behave, but he then takes that extra action to secure Ruth as his wife. And of course, it's not just a love story that gives him a wife and a son, but it restores hope for the widow, Naomi, a class of people who are often ignored or exploited. And I love the fact that in the Bible, God has always got a heart for vulnerable women. And the church needs to be championing vulnerable women and men and boys and girls as well. So I think it's a wonderful story because it gives hope, not just in personal relationships, but to the village, and then, of course, to the whole nation, because David comes from that union. So, yeah, that's a wonderful story, a very rich story.
No, thank you. It was a helpful way how you describe it. And actually, again, that's a strong example how the woman played the role, even have that life bitterness, but not, coming with revenge or this bitterness kind of become a toxic, but actually, gave the health in it. And one thing, when I listening how you describe those relationships, there's another element, it comes in my mind when people ask me describe what is a mentoring. There's a 3 aspects is important. Safe people. I feel safe with that person because, again, knowing and trusting his agenda. Safe place and safe conversation. If you have those 3 things in a place, then you can be vulnerable, and there is kind of healing and there is a growth to take place. Both of us been talking about pointing out to the Old Testament. Any example from the New Testament?
Yeah. I think we have to mention Paul, because so often Paul is seen as somebody who actually didn't really like women. But in fact, in Romans chapter 16, where he's just talking about his friendship and his relationships with all sorts of people, what comes through really strongly is that he uses the word co-workers about men and women equally. And it's a wonderful description of the way he went about working. It comes at the end of this great book of theology, the book that we go to establish our faith. And yet here's in chapter 16 is this practical example of how men and women can get it right together. The world deals in power and hierarchies. And Paul says, no, we're co-workers. he didn't even have disciples, I don't think, and he certainly didn't have some sort of great organization. Or it's just him talking about these helpers that he had. You know, that wonderful word in Genesis, Ezer, that helper to come alongside to defend. And he calls, the very first one he talks about in chapter 16 is Phoebe, a woman. She's called a servant of the church. She's been his sponsor, so she obviously financially supported the church and him. She carried Paul's letter to the Romans, and that was a big responsibility. She must have read the letter and expanded on it, and she was treated with respect and obviously trusted to deliver this great treatise on faith. And then there's Priscilla and Aquila, who are co-workers, a married couple. They risked their lives for Paul. There was a church in their house, and Priscilla is named first in that couple 4 out of the 6 times that the couple is mentioned. And I think it's probably because she was the stronger one, the more upfront one. And I think that's a great example as well. We don't have to worry about our status and whether we're, you know, a certain kind of man or a certain kind of woman in the church. We shouldn't have to, because God gifts us differently. And they were given the job together of explaining the gospel, remember, to Apollos, who had got a few things wrong in Acts chapter 18. And so she was obviously a respected teacher as well. But other people are just commended for being hard workers or, you know, being workers in the Lord. The mother of Rufus, who doesn't even get her own name, is referred to as Paul's spiritual mother. Isn't that a wonderful thing, that as older men and women, we can be spiritual mothers and fathers to people? And Junia has been in prison with Paul, and she is mentioned as an apostle, in fact, prominent among the apostles. So she was a real leader. And I think we just need to look at that chapter to see Paul reaching out with such affection to his friends, his co-workers, coming alongside him and him coming alongside them, helping each other. It's a really healthy way to see the church. And I think we have to be a bit more like that, being less fearful about working with the opposite sex, and remembering that we can strive together and fight together and teach and share prison cells together. And we weaken the gospel when we ignore that chapter.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, I hope the content and our sharing and perspective help you, rest of you, to process your own view and perspective on this question. And if you had any questions to ask, feel free to put in a chat. We are not the only smartest people in this room. There's more people have an experience and an understanding. It's more our view and perspective and experience, which try to capture in Bible passages and also in other images what we share. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Igors. It was great fun presenting together. And yeah, we look forward to the discussion live.
Yes, thank you.